We're going to start this puppy up. Clear, prop.
And welcome back to building the Affordaplane. This week we're working on the rudder. Got a couple of bends, a bunch of hinges, a very important part of the tail feathers here. If you'd like to see these videos completed to the very end when this aircraft is actually flying, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon club. It's with your support that we're able to keep moving ahead with these videos. Well, let's get started.
So let's talk about laying out the rudder. Our first step is to get a piece of blank paper. It has to be 48 inches wide, maybe more like 50, because we're going to use up 48 inches for one of the sides of the rudder. And then just another 20 or 30 inches in the other direction. Now, our goal is to transfer what is on our plans to full size. So let's talk about transferring what we have here to here. Now, the easiest way I found was like we did with the rudder fin, and that is locating a minimum number of points as reference points, and then the rest can be drawn very easily after that. So looking at our plans, we notice that going across the top, the backbone of the rudder, is a 48-inch tube. We're using all 1-inch tube here. So at the top, I picked 2 points, just put them anywhere, first point on one side, and then measured 48 inches out and marked the other point. So our first 2 points are simply 48 inches apart with a straight line between them. And those 2 points represent the bottom of the 48-inch tube that goes across here. So this is the very bottom outside of the tube corner, and this is the very bottom corner outside end of the other end of the tube. So that's very easy. Now let's look at creating our third point. So here is the full-size template for the rudder. I have drawn it out from the plans. You'll notice at the corners that we have 2 curve radiuses. This is the original 3-inch. Same with over here, very sharp. And then you know the wider 8-inch. Here's the wider 8-inch radius curve, which is more appropriate for our conduit bender, which makes the wider curves. So I will be using these curves. So we have one piece that starts here, comes around, so it has 2 bends, and then just a single straight piece 48 inches long. We're going to start with the straight piece because we have a set of hinges that need to be placed on it, and as we learned before, it's much easier to deal with hinges before it's attached to the other part of the rudder. So we're going to go get our fin, because the rudder, of course, hangs onto the fin with 3 hinges and allows it to rotate. So step 1, cut a piece of 1-inch tube to 48 inches, should match our template, and then we'll get 3 hinges and our fin to line it up. Here is our 48-inch rudder tube, and of course we have our fin here where it'll be attached to. So this is the tube that's going to get the hinges that match up with the fin. And if you notice, I have assembled the other side of the hinge like this. It's pretty self-explanatory, but basically another pair of the stainless steel tangs are put back to back, and I've inserted them inside, of course, the fins hinge. I also added a washer just to make it a little bit tighter. If you recall, we left enough room for 3 washers, or 2 tangs and 1 washer as it is. And the idea is that we're going to match up the rudder backbone here that's going to get the hinge. And of course, we need to make sure that the top of the rudder post is even with the top of the fin post. And move this up and down until they're even. So what this allows us to do, and the first hinge is the easiest one to do, we're simply going to mark where the center of the hinge is going to be located, and then we can take this apart and drill and rivet the first hinge. So the first hinge is the easiest ones. It's the ones that's further down that we got to keep lined up. So I'm simply going to mark this. So with our post exactly where we want it, I'm going to mark the center of the hinge right here, and that's all we need. So I'm going to take the hinge apart and place it anywhere along the tube as long as the center is right here. And then once that hinge is mounted and riveted, just like we built this one, we can then put this in place and then mount and line up the other hinges. So I've set up the hinge to install onto our rudder post. I've used some plastic ties. It's very handy for holding it in place. Now remember, it doesn't matter where this hinge goes in this direction because it's the first hinge, but the important thing is that I have it lined up and down based on my mark. So I'm going to go ahead and drill these just like we did in our last part when we drilled the rudder fin. And I'll go ahead and rivet this in place. And notice, of course, I temporarily held them nice and tight together with a small AN3 bolt, and that just keeps everything lined up real nice while drilling and installing. We finished installing the hinge, and now we're going to reconnect it using a bolt or the clevis pin. But before we do that, draw a line down the middle so that we have a good location for the next 2 hinges that are going to be attached. Now, at our next location, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set up another hinge and install a temporary bolt to hold it tight and get it lined up straight, and then we can move our rudder tube into place. Of course, we need to first pin it at the top hinge so that will lock in its location. Now with this hinge in place, we're going to need to outline the hinges and mark the holes so that we get a nice exact position for drilling after we disconnect it. Notice my hinge is a little bit crooked, but that's because it matches the little bit crooked hinge on the other side. And then we have attached hinge number 2 to the proper location with some ties, and then we'll go ahead and drill and rivet this one. And of course, we're just following the tracing that we put on there to get it back into the exact location when we had it fitted up to the other side. So there's number 1, and we just finished number 2. And we're going to perform the procedure one more time for hinge number 3. I have it strapped in place. I have outlined its location, and I will pull it off now and drill. Now we can look at all 3 hinges in place and make sure you can insert the pin. And here's another view of it. There's our top hinge, the center one, and the lower one. And of course we have a tail down here. Now we can remove this and put it back, the rudder post, so that we can finish the rest of the rudder. Now we're ready to make our bends. At the top of the screen is the top of the rudder, and at the bottom here is where we're going to start. That is a 90-degree bend, and what we're going to do is measure the stub so that we can place our conduit bender in the right place. We're going to make this all out of one piece with both bends. Now, if we measure the length of our stub and the stub tail, we're going to go from here to about up here. And I got 20. I'm going to add an inch because we can always cut off the excess down here. We don't want to come up short. So I'm going to say that we want a 21-inch stub to head that way. So we're going to end up bending it up this way. Let me go get a piece of tubing. Here's our 1-inch tube, and we said we wanted 21 inches. There's 21 inches, but remember we're going to deduct 8 inches, so that takes us back to 13. So by placing my arrow at 13 and bending up, I will get 13 plus 8, which is 21 inches, and 21 inches is more than enough for this here. All right, so the way this is going to work, I won't bend it on the table, I promise you, but let's take a look at how it's supposed to look. Right there. There's our arrow. Here's our 13-inch mark. We're going to bend this up and get 21. To the floor. Okay, as you notice, we have come up shy of the 90 degrees that we need. And you may be saying, hey, I bent this as far as it would go. And that is true. This tube has tremendous spring back. So even though we bring it down nearly all the way to 90, it doesn't retain the bend and springs back. That's not the same for the steel that electricians use, the steel piping they use. It's definitely different behavior. So what are we to do? That bender cannot go beyond 90 degrees. So instead of putting our mark right here, which is where we started, the mark is always, the arrow on the bender is always at the beginning of where the bend is about to start. Notice it's straight and it starts to bend. And that turned out pretty good. Now obviously we have to trim off down here so that we get the fit that we want. And we're done with this, and we need to go to the other end and mark that and make the bend down at the other end. Now, what to do here? We want to follow this curve down to here. We have plenty of tubing left. The curve starts right here. We're straight up until this point here. So I'm going to put a mark here. Everything's approximate. Now, what we know about the bender is that when we place the arrow here and make a bend, the point that the arrow points to is the part that begins the bend. Everything in front is straight and everything after gets a curve. So I'm simply going to place the bender like this. There's the arrow, and I'm going to bend this way. Until we bend it enough to go here. Now this is less than a 90-degree bend, so we just need to watch it as we go that we don't go too far. And again, I'm going to bend this way with the arrow where the bend begins. Very important to keep everything flat, right? Our curve down at the other end is flat on the table. When we place this on the tube, we have to make it flat. We don't want to move it up this way or down the other way. Otherwise, our bends won't sit flat on the table. If they start flat on the floor, when you raise it up, it should remain in the same plane. Let's hope so. All right. You can see from this angle that my most recent bend was overbent slightly, and we'll have to live with that slightly different angle. And here's the rudder with the vertical section in place. We are now ready to add the gussets like we did before with the fin. In preparation for the gussets, we want to make sure that we draw center lines on all of the ends, and that will make it possible for the gussets to be located properly. Also on the bottom, this is the bottom of the rudder, we definitely want a center line along the bottom for about 5 inches. Use your favorite tool for doing that. Remember, it has a hole on each side, so we want the top and the bottom on the bottom of the rudder, because we're going to place a horn down there, and it's just easier to mark the bottom line at this time. And now we're at the top of the rudder, and the plans call for an R2 gusset. But due to the fact that I bent mine at a slightly different angle, notice I'm coming in more at 90 degrees than the angle, the R2 from the plans book is not going to fit. Because this is a 90, what will fit is the A gusset that we used previously on the fin, and that's because it was 90 degrees for that one. So use the appropriate gusset, and we know that we got the right one when we can see the lines through both tubes onto the gussets. And once we have them located properly, we can go ahead and drill just like we did for the fin, so we won't cover all that information again. And also notice that I am propping up the end tube here because we want to make sure that the hinges are 90 degrees compared to the top of the tube where we drew the line. So just make sure that this tube is in the right direction, facing straight up, before we go and drill our gussets. And we can cleco those in place till we get to the one on the other side. And we'll deburr and then rivet, and the same with the bottom. Disassemble, deburr, and then rivet with our stainless steel rivets. And then we'll flip it over to do the other side. And we will flip it over and do the other side. And here we have the rudder finished. Finished almost. Now on the bottom of the rudder, that's the wider part. The narrow part is the top. And of course, the other way to always remember is that we have no hinge at the bottom. But we need to create a rudder horn, which will go on the bottom. So next week, we have to make the rudder horn and install the rudder and fin onto the fuselage. Don't miss that. And back to building.